All right, we're going to do chapter 1 of the Lando Stories, The Wishing Spell. And you'll see that I got nice and comfy. I have a little blanket here. So whatever you need to do to get yourself nice and comfy. Once upon a time, Mrs. Peters said in her 6th grade class, these are the most magical words our world has ever known, and a gateway into the greatest stories ever told. There is an immediate calling to anyone who hears them, a calling into a world where everyone is welcome and anything can happen. Mice can become men, maids can become princesses, and they can teach valuable lessons in the process. Alex Bailey eagerly sat up in her seat, usually enjoying her teacher's lessons, but this was something especially close to her heart. Fairy tales are much more than silly bedtime stories, a teacher continued. The solution to almost every problem imaginable can be found in the outcome of a fairy tale. Fairy tales are life lessons disguised in colorful characters and situations. The Boy Who Cried Wolf teaches us a value of good reputation, and the power of honesty. Cinderella shows us the rewards of having a good heart. The Ugly Duckling teaches us that meaning of inner beauty. Alex's eyes were wide, and she nodded in agreement. She was a pretty girl with bright blue eyes and short strawberry blonde hair that was always kept neatly out of her face in a headband. The ways the other students stared at their teacher as if the lesson being taught were in another language was something Mrs. Peters had never grown accustomed to. So Mrs. Peters would often direct an entire lesson to the front row where Alex sat. Mrs. Peters was a tall woman, a thin woman, who always wore dresses that resembled old patterned sofas or couches. Her hair was dark and curly, and sat perfectly on top of her head like a hat, and her students often thought it was. Through a pair of thick glasses, her eyes were permanently squinted from the judgmental look she had given the classes over the years. Sadly, these timeless tales are no longer relevant in our society, Mrs. Peters said. We have traded their brilliant teachings for small-minded entertainment, like television and video games. Parents now let obnoxious cartoons and violent movies influence their children. The only exposure to the tales some children acquire are versions by film companies. Fairy tale adaptations are usually stripped of the moral and lesson of the stories and are usually originally intended to teach and now have been replaced with singing and dancing forest animals. I recently read that films are being created depicting Cinderella as a struggling hip-hop singer and Sleeping Beauty as a warrior princess battling zombies. Awesome, a student behind Alex whispered to himself. Alex shook her head. Hearing this made her soul hurt. She tried to share her disapproval with her fellow classmates, but sadly her concerns were not reciprocated. I wonder if the world would be a different place if everyone knew these tales in a way that the Grimm brothers and Hans Christian Andersen intended them to be known, Mrs. Peters said. I wonder if people who learned from the Little Mermaid's heartbreak when she dies at the end of her real story. I wonder if there would be so many kidnappings if children were shown the true dangers of the Little Red Riding Hood. I wonder if delinquents would be inclined to misbehave if they knew about the consequences Goldilocks caused for herself with the 3 bears. There's so much to learn to prevent for our futures if we just open our eyes to the teachings. Perhaps if we embrace fairy tales as much as we could, it would be much easier to find our happily ever after. If Alex had her way, Mrs. Peters would be rewarded with the thunderous applause after each lesson she gave. Unfortunately, all of that followed her lessons were a mutual sigh of relief among the students, thankfully that it was over. Let's see how well y'all know fairy tales, the teacher said with a smile, and began pacing the room. In Rumpelstiltskin, what did the young maiden's father tell the king that his daughter could spin hay into? Does anyone know? Does anyone know? Anyone? Anyone? She scanned the classroom like a shark looking for a wonderful fish. Only one student raised her hand. Yes, Miss Bailey, Mrs. Peters called. He claimed he could spin hay into gold, Alex said. Very good, Mrs. Bailey, Mrs. Peters said. If she had a favorite student, not that she would ever admit to having one, Alex would have been it. Alex was always eager to please. She was the definition of bookworm. It didn't matter what time of day it was, before school, during school, after school, before bed, she was always reading. She had a thirst for knowledge, and because of it, Alex was usually the first person to answer Mrs. Peters' questions. She tried her best to impress her classmates with every chance she got, putting extra effort into each book report and class presentation she was assigned to. However, this usually annoyed the other students, and Alex was often teased for it. She constantly heard the girls making fun of her behind her back. She usually spent lunch alone under the tree, somewhere with an open library book. Although she would never tell anyone, Alex was so lonely that sometimes it hurt. Now, can anyone tell me what compromise the maiden made with Rumpelstiltskin? Alex waited for a moment before putting up her hand. She didn't want to seem like a total teacher's pet. Yes, Miss Bailey. In exchange for turning the hay into gold, the maiden promised Rumpelstiltskin her firstborn child when she became queen, Alex explained. That's a pretty steep deal, said the boy behind Alex. What's a creepy old short man with a baby want a baby anyway? The girl next to him asked. Obviously, he couldn't adopt with the name Rumpelstiltskin, another student added. Did he eat the baby? Someone else asked nervously. Alex looked around to face her clueless peers. You're all missing the point of the story, Alex said. Rumpelstiltskin took advantage of the maiden because she was in need. The story is about the price of a bad negotiation. What are you willing to give up in the long term for the future for something short term in the present? Get it? If Mrs. Peters could change facial expressions, it would have looked very proud. Nicely put, Mrs. Bailey, she said. I must say, in all my years of teaching, I've rarely come across a pupil with such depth knowledge as... A loud snore suddenly came from the back of the classroom. A boy in the back row was slouched over his desk and drooling from the corner of his mouth and very much asleep. Alex had a twin brother. And it was moments like these that made her wish she didn't have one. Mrs. Peters diverted her attention to him like paperclip to magnets. She looks at him real fast. Mr. Bailey, Mrs. Peters asked. He continued to snore. Mr. Bailey, Mrs. Peters asked again, kneeling down closer. He let out another enormous snore. A few of the students wondered how it was possible for such a loud noise to come out of him. Mr. Bailey, Mrs. Peters shouted in his ear. As if someone had lit a firework underneath his seat, Connor jumped back to life, almost knocking over his desk. Where am I? What happened? Connor asked in a panicked state of confusion. His eyes darted around the room. His brain tried to remember what he was doing. Like his sister, he had bright blue eyes and strawberry blonde hair. His face was round and freckled, and at that moment slightly smushed to the side like a basset hound when it first wakes up from a nap. All right, and before I move on, I wanted to show you guys my visualization. So remember when she talked about him sleeping on the desk? That is very hard to see. Sleeping on the desk, so I drew him sleeping. It says, I visualized Connor sleeping in class. This is before she woke him up. So I started it. I didn't quite finish it. Alex couldn't have been more embarrassed by her brother. Besides, sharing looks and a birthday, she and her brother couldn't have been more different. Connor may have had a lot of friends, but unlike his sister, he had trouble in school, mostly trouble staying awake. I'm so glad you could rejoin us, Mrs. Bailey, Mrs. Peters said sternly. Did you have a nice nap? Connor turned bright red. I'm so sorry, Mrs. Peters, he apologized, trying to be as genuine as possible. Sometimes when you talk for long periods of time, I just doze off. No offense, I just can't help it. You fall asleep in my class at least twice a week, Mrs. Peters reminded him. Well, you do talk a lot. Before he could stop himself from saying it, Connor knew it was the wrong thing to say, and a few of the students bit on their hands to stop them from laughing. I recommend you stay awake while I teach, Mr. Bailey, Mrs. Peters threatened. Connor had never seen anyone squint their eyes so tight without shutting them before, unless you know enough about fairy tales to teach the lesson yourself, she added. I probably do, Connor said. Once again, he spoke without thinking. I I know a lot about this stuff. That's all." "Oh, really?" said Mrs. Peters. She never backed down from a challenge, and every student's worst nightmare was that they'd be challenged by her. "All right, Mr. Bailey, if you're so knowledgeable, answer this question." Connor gulped. "In the original tale of Sleeping Beauty, how many years does a princess sleep before she is awoken by true love's first kiss?" Mrs. Peters asked, studying his face. All eyes were on him, impatiently waiting for a slight indication that he didn't know the answer, but fortunately for Connor, he did. 100, Connor answered. "Sleeping Beauty slept for 100 years. That's why the castle grounds were covered in vines and stuff, because the curse affected everyone in the kingdom, and there was no one to guard it." Mrs. Peters didn't know what to say or do. She frowned down at him, immensely surprised. This was the first time he had ever been correct when she put him on the spot, and she certainly hadn't expected it. "Tried to stay conscious, Mr. Bailey. Lucky for you, I used my last attention slip this morning, but I can always request some more," Mrs. Peters said, and promptly walked to the front of the class and continued her lesson. Connor sighed with relief, and the red drained from his face. His eyes met his sister's, and she was surprised he had gotten the answer right. Alex had expected Connor to remember the fairy tales. "Now, class, I want you all to get to your literature books. Turn to page 170 and read Little Red Riding Hood quietly to yourself," Mrs. Peters instructed. The students did as they were told. Connor made himself comfortable as possible at his desk and began reading. The stories, the pictures, the characters were all too familiar. And then it goes to a different section. One of the things Alex and Connor looked forward to most was when they were very young. They had trips to see their grandmother. She lived up in the mountains in the heart of the woods in a tiny house that could best be described as a cottage, if such a thing still existed. It was a long journey, a few hours by car, but the twins loved every minute of it. Their anticipation would grow, and as they would travel the winding roads through the endless trees. "We're almost there! We're almost there!" Once they arrived, their grandma would greet them at the door with their arms and open arms and hugs so tight they would almost pop. "Look at you two! You've both grown a foot since I last saw you," Grandma would say, even if they hadn't, and then would lead them inside, where freshly baked cookies awaited them. Their father had grown up in the woods and would spend hours each day telling the twins his adventures as a kid. All the trees he climbed, the streams he swam, and all the ferocious animals he barely escaped from. Most of his retellings were highly exaggerated, but we loved the time with him more than anything else in the world. "Someday, when you're older, I'll take you all to the secret place where I used to play," their father teased them. He was a tall man with kind eyes and a wrinkly that would wrinkle any time he smiled. And he smiled quite a bit, especially when he was teasing the twins. At night, the twins' mother would help their grandmother cook dinner, and after they had eaten, as soon as the dishes were done, the family would sit around the fireplace. Their grandmother would open a big storybook, and she and their father would take turns reading to the twins fairy tales until they fell asleep. Sometimes the Bailey's family would be up until sunrise. They told the stories with such detail and passion that it didn't matter how many times the twins heard the same story. They were their best memories any child could ask for. Unfortunately, the twins hadn't been back there to the grandmother's cottage in what was a very long time. "Mr. Bailey," Mrs. Peters shouted. Connor dozed off again. "Sorry, Mrs. Peters," he bellowed back, sitting straight up in his seat like a soldier on guard. If looks could kill, Connor would have been dead from the scowl she was sending. "What did you think of the Little Red Riding Hood?" the teacher asked the class. A girl with frizzy hair and thick braces raised her hand. "Mrs. Peters?" frizzy-haired girl asked. "I'm confused." "And why is that?" Mrs. Peters asked, as if asking, what on earth could possibly be so confusing about this? "Because it says a big bad wolf is killed by the hunter," the frizzy girl explained. "I always thought the wolf was just upset because the other wolves in the pack made fun of his snout, and he and the Little Red Riding Hood became friends in the end. At least that's what happened in the cartoon I used to watch when I was little." Mrs. Peters rolled her eyes so far to the back of the head she couldn't have seen what was coming behind her. And guys, I'm going to have to pause there. I will finish this with the next chapter because I only get 15 minutes on a video. I hope you liked my visualization. Make sure you're doing those too. I would love to see pictures to hang up in the hallway. I still would like to hang some stuff up in the hallway for you guys. And see you later.